Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another true crime video. I hope you guys are all having a great day so far and hopefully you had a wonderful Mother's Day weekend. Last week we discussed week 1 of the Karen Read trial. If you haven't heard of this case, Karen Read is on trial after she was accused of killing her boyfriend, Officer John O'Keefe. She has been charged with second-degree murder, motor vehicle manslaughter, and leaving the scene of a collision causing a death. The Commonwealth alleges that after a night of drinking, Karen Read and John O'Keefe go to a friend, Brian Albert's house. However, when they arrive, John O'Keefe gets out of the car and in a drunken rage, Karen Read hits John O'Keefe with her car, leaving him outside to die in the snow. At least I think that's what they're alleging. As I'm watching this trial day in and day out, from the very beginning, the prosecution never really laid out a great foundation during their opening statements or what story they're really going with what happened that night. And as the days go on, their line of questioning still just kind of leaves me lost. And if you haven't seen my first video, I'm really trying to go into this case just looking at what is being presented to the jury to understand what verdict they might come to. So I'm not looking or outsourcing my information elsewhere, just what's being presented in the courtroom. Now, Karen Read's defense alleges a large-scale cover-up, whereas this takes place in the small town of Canton, Massachusetts. And Karen Read, being the outsider, really leaves her to be an easy scapegoat, as everyone else in this case seems to be very well connected to each other. Just about every witness that has been called to the stand so far has admitted to knowing the Alberts in some capacity. And that's where this incident took place, right on the lawn of Brian Albert. Now, to be fair, the Alberts seem to be a very large family. If I'm not mistaken, I want to say that there's 7 siblings amongst them, not including the children. So it is a very large family, and being that it's a small town, it does make sense that these people would know one another. However, as we get into this trial and looking at the investigation, I think that it was clear from the get-go that some of the people involved should have taken a step back because of the conflict of interest. Now, if you missed the first video where I covered week 1, I do recommend watching that one first. Otherwise, this video might leave you a little bit lost, unless, of course, you are watching the trial elsewhere, that I'm sure that you will be all caught up. Because today we are talking about week 2 of the Karen Read trial. So let's go ahead and get into it because there is a lot to unpack. In week 2, we heard the testimony from a few of the Alberts as well as some of the friends of Karen Read and John O'Keefe. But in my view, so far, the prosecution hasn't really began prosecuting. I haven't seen anything that has pointed to Karen Read being guilty, nor have I seen anything that might have been a motive for killing John O'Keefe. Now, I don't know what the prosecution's game plan is here. We do still have a lot of trial to go. They said that this trial should be around 6 to 8 weeks, so we might be just a quarter of the way through. So who knows what they really have planned down the line. But as of right now, I find myself having more questions than answers. The week began with the law enforcement officers who were first at the scene, who processed the crime scene, as well as the ones who began the initial interviews. The prosecution went into painful repetition, asking nearly every witness the same questions, establishing that they were all at the bar called the Waterfall the night of John O'Keefe's death. Who was at the bar, where were they sitting, what bar they were sitting at, and I'm honestly surprised that at this point, we don't know the dimensions of the table that they were sitting at. We were also introduced to the Alberts family dog, who we find out was rehomed shortly after the death of John O'Keefe. And then we get into some of the testimonies of the people who were at Brian Albert's residence the night/morning where John O'Keefe was found on the lawn. And with these testimonies, we have began to form a timeline of what happened from the time that they were at the waterfall up until the point of when John O'Keefe's body was found. And then we get the timeline of what happened after John O'Keefe's body was found when it came to the interviews, the processing of the evidence, as well as some phone calls, ultimately until we get to the arrest and arraignment of Karen Reed. So last week, we left off with fire medic Katie McLaughlin when she was under some pressure as the defense asked her who Caitlin Albert is. Now, we've come to find out that Caitlin Albert is one of Brian Albert's children. But McLaughlin seemed to try to put some distance between herself and Caitlin Albert, as she merely said that they were just acquaintances. The defense then brought out photos showing the two of them together at a number of different social events. Now, I did give Katie McLaughlin the benefit of the doubt because I can certainly relate to that. There are people that I went to high school with that I'm sure I have a number of photos with. However, as of today, I haven't spoken to those individuals for maybe a decade. However, throughout the weekend, the internet did what the internet does best, and the defense team received upwards of 40 photos. Perhaps the most damning photo was a photo of Katie McLaughlin and Caitlin Albert at a baby shower just months before John O'Keefe's death. So I certainly wouldn't categorize that as an old photo, such as she had with the other photos. But for those of you asking why this is important, Katie McLaughlin was one of the witnesses who testified to hearing Karen Reed admit that she hit John O'Keefe. So as the jury hears these close ties and the interconnectedness of the first responders and the investigators, it doesn't look good. Furthermore, it kind of aligns more with what the defense is alleging more so than the prosecutors. And the fact that she tried to distance herself from Caitlin Albert really just made it look 1,000 times worse. Now, the jury hasn't seen those photos yet because they weren't in the courtroom when the defense brought this to the attention of the court. And the judge essentially said that they're going to take it photo by photo. And I believe they will be brought to evidence when Caitlin Albert is on the stand, which we heard should be on Monday. Earlier in the week, we heard from Canton police officers, Sergeant Sean Good, Lieutenant Gallagher, and Sergeant Lank, who processed the scene. Sergeant Good said that they did attempt to put caution tape around the crime scene. However, due to the wind, it just was not working out. And because all of this was taking place so early in the morning and there was a lot of snow, it was really cold outside, there wasn't really any people around to keep out of the crime scene, so they didn't really think that it was necessary. Sergeant Good also admitted to knowing not only Brian Albert, but Brian's brother, Kevin Albert, as he is a Canton police officer. So they worked together for nearly 2 decades. Lieutenant Gallagher testified to using the leaf blower to look for evidence, where we actually can see a video of him using it. And during his testimony, he mentioned that they were able to get all the way to the ground, about a 6x6 or 7x7 area around which John O'Keefe was found. However, we don't know those exact measurements because the investigators failed to measure really anything. So we really don't know those specifics. But he did mention that he found the bottom piece of a cocktail glass. What he didn't find was the pieces of taillight, the missing shoe, or the baseball cap that many witnesses said that John O'Keefe was wearing on that night. Now, we did find out that pieces of the taillight would be found days later. However, when it comes to the baseball cap and the missing shoe, you might know more than I do because, like I said, I'm really trying just to go off of what's being presented in the courtroom in front of the jury. So I don't know if they ever find the shoe or the baseball cap, but I am curious to see how the prosecution or the defense uses this to tie in their theory. Now, the cross-examination began with the defense attorneys pointing out that while a police officer was found deceased on this front lawn, they never went inside to look around. Now, as these testimonies continue, we do find out that they went inside to talk to the residents inside of the home. However, when Lieutenant Gallagher was asked if he looked inside for any physical items, perhaps look to see if that cocktail glass that they found maybe would match ones that were inside, he responded, quote, "Of course not."
At the time that you found the broken glass, would you rationally think, well, maybe the rest of this glass is inside the residence?
No.
You did not think that?
No, there was a reason that I didn't think that.
Did you think that, well, let me ask you this. Did you ever go inside the house to search for the other part of the glass?
Absolutely not.
Because you made up your mind initially where that glass came from.
Objection.
You can answer that, sir.
No.
Did you search the house for any other matching glasses?
No. No.
Matter of fact, you didn't search the house for any physical items, did you?
Of course not.
Is that because that house belonged to a Boston police officer?
No, it's because it requires probable cause, as you know, which we did not have.
Or at least you didn't think you had at that time?
We knew we didn't have it.
Did you seek it from a judge?
I'm familiar with what probable cause is.
Did you seek a probable cause warrant from a judge?
No, I did not.
Right.
Now, given the circumstances of what the defense is alleging, that the Alberts were never looked at because they are families of police. Brian Albert is a police officer. Using the term, of course not, when asked if you went inside to look around for any physical items, just really rubbed me the wrong way. Now, he does go on to clarify that he meant, of course not, because he didn't have a search warrant and believed that there was no probable cause to get a search warrant. However, as these testimonies continue, it's very clear that nobody even attempted to get a search warrant, nor did anybody even ask permission from the Alberts if it was okay if they looked around. Now, this in itself raises some suspicion, because we all know if it was any of us, if there was a dead person on our front lawn, we would not be given that same grace. There is no way that any standard person can have a dead person on their lawn and not even have an attempt of a search warrant for their house. Then we hear from Sergeant Lank, who testified to knowing and being friends with some of the Alberts since grade school. Now, initially, Sergeant Lank was brought in to testify outside of the presence of the jury for events unrelated to this case. One being in 2002, when Lank was an off-duty police officer, he came to the aid of his buddy, Chris Albert.
Did you realize that Chris was getting into some sort of a physical altercation with somebody else in a parking lot?
Yes.
Did you jump into a fist fight in order to protect Chris Albert?
Chris actually approached my vehicle and started to describe an altercation that had been in previously in the night.
When you say your vehicle, your personal vehicle?
Yes.
Okay, so you were off duty, is that right?
Yes.
You had been drinking?
Yes.
Nothing wrong with that, but just
Yes.
so happens that you had been drinking that afternoon.
Yes.
Ultimately, when you realized that Chris Albert was in some sort of fracas, some sort of fight or altercation, you activated yourself as a police officer at the time.
He wasn't in a fracas when he approached my vehicle. He approached my vehicle and stated that he had been in an altercation earlier in the night with one of the Lapalato brothers, and that during that altercation, threats were made against him and his family, and he was seeking advice, because he knew as a police officer, as to how he should go forward. And as I was telling him what to do, that's when a group of men started to walk down Washington Street towards Chris, and he said, "Oh no, here they come."
So that would be Mark Lapalato, correct?
Yes.
And his brother Alfred.
Yes. Alfredo.
Alfredo, sorry. You got out of your car and approached the other men.
Yes.
You also called for a Canton police backup.
I brought my attention to the restaurant owner and a bartender who had walked out into the street, and I yelled for them to call the Canton police.
Canton police did in fact arrive, correct?
They did.
Isn't it true that after you got involved and Canton police arrived, you then instructed some of your colleague police officers to handcuff Alfredo?
I can't recall.
Isn't it true that after Alfredo was handcuffed and, for all intents and purposes, physically incapacitated, you then approached Mark Lapalato?
No.
You got into a fight with Mark Lapalato, though?
Yes.
Another incident, Link was involved in an investigation into the youngest Albert brothers, Tim Albert.
He hit a car
Yes.
with a woman in it, fled the scene, then you find him trying to hide out at 34 Fairview, correct?
He had parked the car at 34 Fairview.
And you didn't have much choice. I mean, there you have it. The evidence is right in front of you. You can't really cover that one up, right?
I would say I did my
Objection,
job.
Your Honor. Move to strike.
So this is voir dire. Could you answer the question, please?
I would say I did my job.
Okay. Did you engage in any kind of a DUI investigation?
We spoke with him.
Did you give him FSTs?
I don't recall if I did. I know I didn't. I don't recall if Officer Good did.
Did you give him a breathalyzer?
I did not.
Did you ask him for a blood test?
I did not.
So no DUI investigation was really undertaken, correct?
Again, I can't recall what Officer Good did, but I was there.
But you didn't do it. You didn't do what I just suggested, a full-blown DUI investigation, even though he hit another car and then fled the scene.
We spoke with him, and he gave an explanation.
And that explanation coming from Tim Albert was, I'm really sorry I panicked, right?
It was something to that nature.
And he turned around, well, I'll just cut to the chase. Y'all ended up charging him with a misdemeanor, correct?
I believe so.
And he was given diversion,
I don't know.
and his record was wiped clean.
I don't know.
That's all I know.
Now, the prosecution argued that these events are completely irrelevant to the Karen Reed case. However, the defense argued that they are relevant as it shows the lengths that Lank is willing to go to protect or help the Albert family. Now, the judge ultimately allowed some of these details to be produced in front of the jury. However, she specified that the details have to be specifically related to the Alberts, leaving the judgment up to the jury, and they get to determine the credibility of his testimony as well as the likelihood of his potential involvement in a cover-up. Now, during these testimonies of how this scene was processed, I found myself getting so upset because of how sloppy this investigation was done right from the beginning. This scene wasn't processed with a single shred of integrity from my view, as we heard that the blood droplets that they found in the snow were collected with red Solo cups. Yes, like the red Solo cups that we used to play beer pong with, those types of red Solo cups. And if that's not bad enough, they were then placed in a Stop and Shop brown paper bag. And I would be lying if it said it ended there, because then we see photos of this bag, unsealed, sitting directly next to Karen Reed's SUV. And at one point, the defense asked Sergeant Lank if the photo shows the cups of the purported blood, and he responds with, "It appears so, but I can't say definitively." If you can't say definitively, that's the problem. Because as we see in this photo, the bag lacks any type of evidence tape. It wasn't sealed, nor did it have any type of label to preserve the evidence inside, leaving it open for anybody to access and opening up the possibilities of cross-contamination, especially considering it was sitting directly next to the tail height of Karen Reed's SUV.
Would you agree that having unsealed and unsecured blood next to the right rear portion of the SUV is a recipe for cross-contamination?
You want me to speak to, if I could speak to this incident alone?
That's a yes or no question. Do you think
Okay,
that's
it's not yes or no, but for your purposes, I would say yes.
and in fact, could even be worse, for instance, not just inadvertent cross-contamination. If somebody wanted to touch something on that bag, on those cups, and then touch the vehicle, they could easily do that with that juxtaposition of the open blood next to the back of the rear of the car.
Objection.
Sustained.
Sergeant Lank goes on to explain that after being a police officer for nearly 30 years, he doesn't recall ever using evidence tape, which just sounds like complete BS to me. And I'm wondering, from the view of the jury, does it make it look like he's playing dumb, or does he look incompetent? Either way, I can't imagine that the jury is going to think too highly of his testimony or the part that he played in this investigation. Now, for those of you who believe that Karen Reed is guilty, and she very well may be, I don't know, I wasn't there, but that's the problem. That if she is truly guilty, this investigation was so botched from the very beginning that all of these failures may lead to reasonable doubt. These protocols are in place to ensure that when a suspect is taken to trial, that the evidence is airtight, and that wasn't done. So if you're upset at the conspiracy theorists in this case, I suggest you direct that anger towards these investigators for dropping the ball this badly, because I don't think they could have done a worse job if they tried. But John O'Keefe genuinely seemed like an incredible person, and he deserved a better investigation than this. And I can only imagine the utter anger and frustration that his family and friends must be feeling watching all of this come to light. Because I know as an outsider, I feel those things. It's just unbelievable how badly this was done. In the middle of the week, the timeline on the night in question was established. Many friends and acquaintances of both John O'Keefe and Karen Reed were called to the stand, and we got a good glimpse of the friends and the community who really rallied behind John O'Keefe after he took in his niece and nephew. Now, I didn't get into this aspect in week 1, but John's sister had died of cancer, and shortly after, her husband died, leaving their 2 children behind. John O'Keefe stepped up and took them in and really took on the role of being a parent. It wasn't as if he had just taken them in and given them a place to live and food to eat, but he really took the role of being a parent seriously, where he was involved in their school and in their sports. And it really is a testament of the kind of person that John O'Keefe is, being a 30-something-year-old man to just take on those kids as if they were his own. Now, all of these individuals, who were more so as the civilians in this case, all testified that they were at the bar called the Waterfall with a large group, including John O'Keefe and Karen Reed. Similarly, they all had the same perspective of that night. Everyone seemed to be having a good time. People were laughing, joking around. And many of the witnesses testified that Karen Reed and John O'Keefe were very lovey-dovey. They were getting along great. Everything was going fine. One of John O'Keefe's friends even testified that during that night, his wife kind of nudged him, saying like, "Hey, why aren't you that affectionate with me?" Showing that John O'Keefe and Karen Reed seemed to be in very good spirits that night. Nobody mentioned anything about tension or fighting between the two, nor did anybody seem to think that Karen was intoxicated. People mentioned that she had taken a glass from a previous bar and she kind of brought it out of her coat, and they said that there was a clear liquid in it. But other than that, nobody seemed to think that she was drunk. She wasn't slurring her words or stumbling around. The closer friends of John O'Keefe mentioned that the issues that John O'Keefe might have mentioned between himself and Karen Reed were that along the lines of her spoiling his niece and nephew. She was buying them expensive clothes, and she would take out the niece to get her nails done and things like that. And again, it's just so odd because it seems as if this really paints Karen Reed in a good light. And what it doesn't do is provide any type of motive as to why Karen Reed would want to kill John O'Keefe. Additionally, we heard testimony that the morning John O'Keefe was found, one of the concerns Karen was expressing was her concern for the children. What were going to happen to the children? And like I said in last week's video, it's odd that all of these testimonies are coming from the witnesses called by the Commonwealth for their case in chief to prove the guilt of Karen Reed. And 2 weeks in, and I still don't see it. As this trial continued, we got into more of the interconnectedness between all of the witnesses in this case. We heard from some of the Alberts, beginning with Chris Albert, who is Brian Albert's brother, and Chris's wife, Julie. Now, Chris and Julie have a few children, one being Colin Albert, who seems to be a large player in this case. It was confirmed that Colin Albert was at his uncle Brian Albert's house on the night in question, celebrating Brian Jr.'s birthday. And it seems as if the timing of Colin Albert's departure from Brian's house is a mark of contention, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, under cross-examination, the defense then went on to enter a text exchange from Chris Albert to John O'Keefe, where Chris told John to come to the waterfall, saying, quote, "If not, I'm going to fuck up your lawn," followed by a laughing emoji, which from my perspective just seems like a playful type of text. It doesn't seem to be anything too serious. We heard that John O'Keefe was very, very neat and orderly, and the type of guy to take his lawn care very seriously. You know, the type of guy that you'll see outside mowing his lawn at 7 o'clock in the morning. Chris Albert said that he and his wife Julie even referred to John O'Keefe as Mr. Nevercracker, which apparently is a character from the movie called Monster House. I've never seen this movie, but apparently this is a character who's kind of the grumpy neighbor who tells kids to get off of his lawn. Now, defense attorney Yannetti tried to establish that John O'Keefe was the type of guy who did not like people on his lawn. However, even though they have him in his phone as Mr. Nevercracker, they still tried to deny that fact. And he goes on to ask Julie Albert about an event where their older son, Colin, walked across his lawn. Julie Albert, however, corrected this version, saying that it wasn't Colin Albert, but it was her younger son, Dylan Albert, who walked across John O'Keefe's lawn in attempts to kind of use it as a shortcut on his way home from school. Now, according to her testimony, Julie Albert did say that John O'Keefe yelled at her son Dylan to get off of his lawn. Dylan then came home kind of scared about the whole situation and told her about it, to where she had a discussion with John O'Keefe. She said that John felt really bad, got him some of his favorite candy to kind of apologize to Dylan, and they kind of hashed it out, and it was no big deal. The defense then presented a photo to the jury showing Julie and Chris Albert on John O'Keefe's lawn, where he seemed to have put up a new fence, and they're kind of straddling the fence, which again, in my opinion, just seems to be kind of playful hazing. Nothing that I would really take too seriously. However, it seems as if the defense is trying to paint this as a possible motive. Now, maybe there's more to this to come, but based on what we've seen in the courtroom so far, some of these aspects just seems like the defense is really trying to make much out of nothing. And I think if they do this too much without really having the receipts to back it up, it might start to backfire, but we'll see how this plays out. Now, really quickly, because there's so many people involved on that night at the waterfall, there was Brian and Nicole Albert, Brian's friend, who's also named Brian Higgins, and Brian Higgins is an ATF agent, Chris and Julie Albert, and Jennifer and Matt McCabe, or Jen. Jen McCabe is seemingly best friends with Julie Albert and the sister-in-law of Nicole Albert. So with this whole group of people, and then we have John O'Keefe and Karen Reed. Karen Reed is also really good friends with Jen McCabe. Now, there was that other couple who testified to being there that night. However, because their involvement really only extends to the waterfall, they don't really seem to be involved with this case other than that. I'm really just going to leave them out just to make it as clear as possible. There's already so many different names floating around, and I just don't want to make it more confusing than necessary. Now, as everyone was kind of getting ready to leave the bar, it seems as if Brian and Nicole Albert may have mentioned that their son Brian Albert, or Brian Albert Jr., was at home celebrating his birthday, and in one way or another, an invitation was extended to all of the people at the bar to kind of take the party back to their house. Now, Julie Albert had left the bar quite a bit earlier due to a migraine. She went ahead and went home, leaving her husband, Chris Albert, to walk home, which just happened to be a short distance. Both of them testified that it was just about a 6 or 7 minute walk. Okay, so everyone left the bar. Julie Albert left quite a bit earlier than everybody else. She had a migraine, which I totally get. She went home. Shortly after that, Chris Albert then walked home, again, a 6 or 7 minute walk. The rest of the people went ahead and went to Brian Albert's residence on 34 Fairview Road. So Brian and Nicole Albert go home, where they say that they saw their son, Brian Albert Jr., two of his friends, their daughter, Caitlin Albert, and their nephew, or Chris and Julie's son, Colin Albert. Brian Higgins also goes into the house, as does Jen and Matt McCabe. We were also introduced to the family dog, Chloe. Chloe is a German Shepherd mix who reportedly had a couple of different incidences of aggression towards other dogs. Now, during the defense's cross, they asked about her biting a person, which Nicole Albert would explain that she did bite a person. However, it was because her dog and another dog were fighting. That person tried to intervene, and that's why Chloe then bit that person. Now, throughout this testimony, we hear how Chloe was eventually rehomed. But while Nicole Albert claimed that she provided the information to the prosecution on how Chloe can be accessed, defense attorney Yannetti seemed to be unaware of this claim. Now, this is important because the scratches that were found on the inside of John O'Keefe's arm during his autopsy has been a huge point of contention, as many argue that those scratches would not be something that you would get from being hit by a car, and many believe they are more consistent with an animal attack, maybe a dog. Now, like with most of the prosecution's case, I'm not exactly sure what their argument is to explain those lacerations on the inside of John O'Keefe's arm. At least it hasn't really been made clear to me. So maybe when we get into the expert testimonies, that might be made a little bit more clear. But back to the party. Now, on direct, the prosecution asked several of these witnesses when Colin Albert left the residence, and they all seem to say that he was the first one to leave, leaving around 12:30, right after midnight, but before John O'Keefe had ever arrived. Julie and Chris Albert testified that Colin Albert arrived about 10 minutes after Chris got home, which they initially both said that Chris had gotten home at 12:10 and Colin arrived home just before 12:30. Whereas here, the defense poked a few minor holes in this story, as footage from the bar showed Chris Albert still at the bar around 12:15, highlighting that their initial testimony suggesting that Colin had arrived around 12:30, there would have been maybe a 15-minute window where he might have arrived just a bit later. Now, I do find it a little bit sus that both Chris and Julie Albert said that Chris arrived home at 12:10. It just seems oddly specific and makes me question if they had maybe rehearsed that timeline. It just seems a little off to me. Additionally, it was brought out that in the interviews that would come later, nobody would have mentioned to the investigators that Colin Albert was ever there that night. Now, they all seem to explain it away by suggesting that his presence there wasn't relevant because as Brian and Nicole Albert were getting home, Colin was just leaving. So because it was kind of in passing, they didn't think it was relevant to mention that Colin was there that night. And from all of the witnesses that we've seen so far, nobody has testified to seeing John O'Keefe or Kieran Reed come inside at any point. Brian Albert Sr. said that when his buddy Brian Higgins was leaving around 1:30 a.m., he decided to go upstairs, get into bed, and go to sleep, where Chloe was in his room with him. Also, as a side note, during the cross-examination of Sergeant Sean Good, he mentioned that although Brian Higgins is an ATF agent, Higgins does have like a satellite type of office at the Canton Police Department. And on the night in question, he did see Brian Higgins come into the office around 1:30 a.m. He went on to say that he didn't really interact with Brian Higgins and he doesn't know why he was there. Now, I don't know what the significance of these questions were as of right now, but maybe when Brian Higgins is called to the stand, we'll get some more answers. Shortly after Brian Higgins left the Albert residence, Jen and Matt McCabe left, followed by Brian Jr.'s friends, leaving Caitlin to leave around 2 a.m. Nicole Albert said that she finished straightening up the house before going to bed just as Caitlin was leaving. Now, when Nicole Albert testified, one thing that I found very interesting was that she mentioned that Caitlin was the last one to leave around 2 a.m., and she wanted to leave before she got stuck in the snow, insinuating that the snow would be relatively light at this point, correct? And if the snow was still pretty low, it brings into question how all of these people left the party that night and not a single person saw John O'Keefe deceased on the lawn. Now, we saw some of the photos that the prosecution introduced showing that where John O'Keefe's body was in relation to the entrance of the house was pretty far away, pointing out that the distance could very well be the explanation as to why nobody saw him. However, the defense introduced a photo that I believe is like a reconstruction photo. I don't think it was an actual picture that somebody took, but this photo shows a completely different perspective of the house, kind of straight on. Now, it's hard for me to determine exactly where John O'Keefe's body was located in relation to the driveway in which all of these people would have to leave. However, The jury has the benefit of actually going to the location of the scene, so they'll be in a better position to determine how far away John's body truly was from the entrance. Now, as a side note, we heard that the Albert residence was often left unlocked, and Nicole Albert kind of explained it away, saying that she has 5 children. People are coming and going, leaving the door unlocked. She would change the locks because the keys would get lost, things like that. So it was just always a mess. So the door stayed unlocked most of the time. But I am curious, as a police officer, they typically take home security more seriously than the average person. And considering that there has been no evidence provided of any type of surveillance footage, I find it odd that did they not have surveillance cameras or motion lights or anything like that? It just seems a little bit strange to me. Again, as we continue with this trial, I just get more questions than answers, unfortunately. However, it was confirmed that where John O'Keefe's body was located on that lawn was essentially directly in front of Nicole and Brian Albert's window. So they are upstairs in the second story. Right outside of their front window is where John O'Keefe's body was found. And this fact certainly adds a lot more questions to the mix. How is it that these officers were using a leaf blower outside of your house, outside of your window, and you didn't hear? Or the sirens, or the screaming? Like none of this commotion woke you up? Not to mention that Brian Albert said their dog Chloe was in the room with them. And I find it hard to believe that the aggressive dog that Chloe is described as being didn't bark or react to any of this noise outside. Something just seems off to me. And it gets deeper because John O'Keefe was found on the lawn around 6 a.m. by Karen Reed, her friend Jen McCabe, who was also there that night, and Carrie Roberts. The defense would show records that Jen McCabe called Nicole twice around 6 a.m., but both Brian and Nicole Albert testified that they didn't wake up until Jen McCabe bursted through their door, where they say Jen McCabe was in hysterics, telling them what had happened to John O'Keefe. Now, right now, there is dispute on whether or not those phone calls that Jen made to Nicole were ever answered, but it still brings into question how odd it is that they slept through all of this. The screams, the sirens, the leaf blower, the phone calls, they slept through it all. I just got so many questions. Now, if you want to give all of these witnesses the benefit of the doubt, that's perfectly fine. But I do find it curious that those who are so willing to give all of these witnesses the benefit of the doubt won't extend a single doubt when it comes to Karen Reed's guilt. It just seems as if when the possibility of putting someone behind bars for potentially the rest of their life, you might extend some of the doubt in their case, as we are supposed to. It's supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. And in this case, I see so many people automatically saying guilty, and we haven't even seen all of the evidence come out yet. Additionally, when we heard the testimonies from the first responders last week, not a single one of them said that Jen McCabe was hysterical. Yet, both Brian Albert and Nicole Albert, both of them said that Jen McCabe was hysterical. It's just quite interesting. So after Brian and Nicole were purportedly made aware of what had happened to John O'Keefe, they said that they were in complete shock, and they went downstairs to talk to the police, who happened to be Sergeant Lake, the same officer who has some quite extensive friendships with some of the Alberts. It's just crazy to me that throughout this investigation, we see a number of people who had connections with the Alberts, and not a single one of them kind of stopped and pulled themselves out and said, you know what, it's not a good idea that I am processing or involved in this investigation. It might look like a conflict of interest, and have someone else do it. Instead, they continued with this investigation. So even if they are correct and Karen Reed truly hit and killed Officer John O'Keefe, This potential conflict of interest just looks so bad, and I just can't believe that they let it happen. Now, during Julie Albert's testimony, she admitted to sending her friend, Jen McCabe, a text message with Sergeant Lang's personal cell phone number. And then Yannetti asked if she saw Jen McCabe delete that text message, to which this question was sustained. So it went unanswered, but perhaps this will be an important piece of evidence that will come out when we see Jen McCabe on the stand. Now, more issues in this investigation were uncovered as it was confirmed that the investigators that interviewed the McCabes and the Alberts that morning failed to separate them and interview them separately. Now, if you pay attention to any of these types of investigations, you will know that it is vital to separate individual witnesses to ensure that their recollection or their memory of what had happened isn't distorted or influenced by what anybody else says. But that didn't happen. They were all interviewed in the same room together. Now, I believe shortly after Sergeant Lank left, around 8:30 a.m., Julie Albert was seen outside on 34 Fairview Road, dropping off donuts for her nephew, Brian Albert Jr., which seems to have been a tradition for his birthday. She mentions that as she was about to put the donuts inside of Brian Jr.'s car, Brian Sr. opened the door and told her that she should come inside. Now, initially, Julie declined, but after Brian seemed a bit serious, reiterating that she should come inside, she obliged. Now, we also found out that her best friend, Jen McCabe, had called her a number of times around 6 a.m., but Julie never returned those calls. Now, here's my issue with this. So, Julie sees that her best friend, Jen McCabe, calls her twice around 6 a.m. and doesn't call her back. Like, if my friend were to call me that early in the morning, something must be wrong. But she doesn't do that. She then goes and gets donuts for her nephew, Brian, which I see no problem with that. But then she goes to drop them off at the 34 Fairview residence, sees that Jen McCabe's car is out front and still doesn't have any interest in what's going on. Not to mention that putting the donuts inside of Brian's car seems a little bit odd as well. Because why would you be putting donuts inside of his car when it's freezing and snowing outside? He's going to have to come outside in the cold to get the donuts. Considering they said that the door is always unlocked, why wouldn't she just drop them off inside? Now, on Friday, we ended with the direct examination of Brian Albert Sr. We haven't seen the cross-examination as of yet. That will begin on Monday morning, but I'm anxious to see how he does and what else will come out. One point of contention that I hope to see some answers to is the selling of the Albert residence. We heard this home at 34 Fairview was in the Albert family for quite some time. And we find out that shortly after John O'Keefe's death, they sold the property, which has certainly drew some suspicion. But during their testimony, both Brian and Nicole said that they were talking about selling the residence before John O'Keefe's death, further explaining that they were discussing it in November of 2021, claiming that at that time, the housing market was booming. And as their children were getting ready to leave the home, it would be the perfect time to downsize. So I'm hoping on cross that Brian Albert will be asked some more clarifying questions about this, such as when did they actually put the house on the market? When did it sell? How much did it sell for? To really establish a better timeline and maybe better understand how much over or under the market value the house sold for. Now, earlier in the trial, it was established that the Canton Police Department did eventually take a step back from the investigation, as they said there wasn't a conflict of interest, but a perceived conflict of interest. When Lieutenant Gallagher was on the stand, he essentially said that because a Boston police officer was found dead on the lawn of another Boston police officer whose brother is a Canton police officer, that in itself has the appearance of a conflict of interest. But as the trial continued later in the week, defense attorney Yannetti would establish additional connections between the Alberts and the lead investigator who was taking over for the Canton Police Department, Trooper Michael Proctor. Chris Albert had confirmed during his testimony that he had known Trooper Michael Proctor for nearly 15 years. And Chris's wife, Julie Albert, testified that she's close friends with Michael Proctor's sister, Courtney Proctor. Julie Albert testified that she's known the Proctors since childhood. During the cross-examination, when she was asked how often she communicates with Courtney Proctor, Julie Albert says that they text fairly often, but when it comes to phone calls, she used the words very rarely.
You are very close with Courtney Proctor, correct?
How would you define very?
Well, I guess I'd ask you to define very close. Do you deny that you were very close with Courtney Proctor?
No, what?
Objection, Your Honor.
No, go ahead. Next question. You got your answer.
I didn't hear the answer.
Go ahead, repeat that.
Do you deny that you were very close with Courtney Proctor?
No.
Okay. You talk regularly, correct?
Yes.
You text each other, correct?
Yes.
You also talk by phone.
Very rarely.
Is it fair to? Did you say very rarely you talk
Phone.
to Courtney Proctor by phone?
Usually it's text.
Between February 1st of 2022 and September 6th of 2022, did you only speak rarely with Courtney Proctor?
I don't recall.
Are you aware that between February 1st of 2022 and September 6th of 2022, you and Courtney Proctor spoke by phone 67 times?
Objection.
Were you aware of that?
No, I don't know the exact count.
The defense then comes in with receipts and provides call logs showing Julie Albert and Courtney Proctor talking 67 times on the phone within a 7-month period, coincidentally speaking on the phone for 12 minutes on the day the defendant was arrested. Now, some may argue that 67 times over a 7-month span isn't very often. However, that is still 2 to 3 calls on average per week, which doesn't seem very rare to me. Now, when Julie Albert was asked what was discussed during these phone calls, she says that she can't recall. So as they pointed out, they were having a 12-minute phone discussion on the same day that Karen Reed was arrested. And on that very next day, it was revealed that when Karen Reed was arraigned, the friends spoke on the phone 3 times before the arraignment happened. And then shortly after Karen Reed was arraigned, the two of them had a nearly half-hour phone call. Julie Albert testifies that she cannot recall any of these phone conversations. And at some point, when Julie Albert was asked if she was using Courtney Proctor as an intermediary to communicate with Trooper Michael Proctor, she denied it. Yannetti then asked Julie if she was nervous to talk to Trooper Michael Proctor, as he might ask the whereabouts of Colin Albert that night. Now, while Julie admitted to being nervous about the police interview, suggesting that is something that most everybody could feel nervous about, she denied that she was concerned about him asking about Colin. Now, all of these testimonies are leaving me with more questions than answers. And in my very unprofessional opinion, if you're wanting to convince a jury to convict somebody of murder, you really should be answering these questions and tying them up with a pretty bow on top. But in my perspective, that's just not what we're seeing so far. I don't think that the jury needs to buy that this was all a cover-up in order to see the undeniably shoddy police work that was done from the very beginning when it came to collecting evidence with red Solo cups, when it came to then storing those cups in a shopping bag without ever putting evidence labels, and then having that bag sitting directly next to the SUV. Then when it comes to the interviews, and none of these witnesses are being separated and asked individually as what happened that night. Literally every point in this investigation, the ball was dropped. And I can't even imagine how they could have up this investigation more if they tried. And for me, as I'm looking at everything as of right now, there is more reasonable doubt than not. And I think that the prosecution has a lot of obstacles to overcome. Now, we've still got a lot of evidence and testimonies ahead of us. So who knows where this thing can go. But I can't wait to see the testimonies from Caitlin Albert. I can't wait to see what Jen McCabe has to say. And I am dying to see Trooper Michael Proctor on the stand because he has got a lot of explaining to do. So that's guaranteed to be spicy. But ultimately, at the end of week 2, I still haven't heard anything, literally not a single thing, that points to Karen Read being guilty. The only thing that I can see so far that remotely points to a guilty verdict is the claim that Karen Read admitted to hitting John O'Keefe with her car, saying, "I hit him." Here's my problem with that. Even those statements have either been said by witnesses who are starting to lack some credibility or people who have had conflicting statements. Not to mention that if you take that statement out of context, you can either say, "I hit him," like it's a statement, or "I hit him," like a question. So if she really did say, "I hit him," that is still not enough for a guilty verdict, in my opinion. Not to mention that, one, as strange as it is, and many people don't believe or understand it, but there is this phenomenon of people making false confessions. It does happen. And considering that she was in shock when she allegedly said this, which everyone who saw her that day said that she was hysterical, I wouldn't really take much of what she said at face value. Because when people are in that state of emotion, people say very bizarre things that don't always make sense. And as I've mentioned time and time again, the prosecution didn't really outline what their theory is during their opening statements. So I feel as if we are attempting to put this puzzle together and we don't really know the full picture. Whereas the defense has done a great job outlining the utter incompetence, if not malice, in the investigation to the death of John O'Keefe. They've also done a great job with the interconnectedness of this network of people, as they claimed during their opening statements. Now, like I said, at this point, I'm not sure that the jury even needs to believe that this was all a cover-up. I think on the sole basis of how poor this investigation was done, leaves more than enough reasonable doubt. And that's going to be a very difficult obstacle for the prosecution to overcome. Now, as of right now, based on only what has been presented inside of the courtroom, I am not convinced that Karen Read is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. However, as we get into these next few weeks, my opinion can change, but that will be dependent on what, if any, evidence is produced by the prosecution. But that's where I'm at right now in the second week of the Karen Read trial. But let me know what you think. Are you leaning more towards guilty or not guilty at this point? What do you think is the strongest piece of evidence against Karen Read at this point? Do you find it strange that Brian and Nicole didn't wake up during all of this commotion right outside of their bedroom window? Let me know all of your thoughts and theories down below. Make sure you hit that like button before you go, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.